So I recently uploaded a video to this channel which included a compilation of police brutality videos, and one of the compilations and one of the clips in that compilation included this one here of a 75-year-old man being shoved by police. Now I'm not really going to sort of show you the video. I'm just sort of, kind of flashing it through so you can, remember it or whatever. But it's pretty outrageous, obviously. I mean, you see him get shoved by police, 75-year-old man, and then after, he falls and gets his head cracked in on the concrete, he's just laying there motionless. And if you look at it, you can see the blood just pouring out of his ear and pulling up there underneath his head because he got shoved so hard by these police officers. And by the way, guys, 75-year-old man, what was he doing? Why was he walking up to the police? Because he found a police helmet on the ground and he was walking over to give it to him because he sees the helmet. He's like, I don't know what to do with this. Here, let me give it back to the cops because they'll know what to do with it. And what do? They just shove. Because what does that mean? It means that if the police had spent literally just 3 seconds listening to what he was saying, like listening, using their ears, then none of this would have happened. None of this would have happened. They would have taken the helmet, done whatever, and then he would have gone on his way, gone along, done his thing. But what do? They just shove him. Their first instinct is to push. It's, oh, well, I was told that that it's curfew right now, so let me just push everybody out of the way, including 75-year-old elderly man who was in critical condition and really, really struggling. Thankfully, now he's in stable condition. He still has severe injuries. He's still struggling, but thankfully now he's stable. So it does look like he's going to make it. They didn't kill him, thank God. But it's just a disgusting incident. It's just completely disgusting that their first instinct is to push and not to listen to what someone has to say. Not to treat them as a human, but to treat them as herded cattle because, oh, it's curfew, so I've got to herd everybody away. Well, there's a major development to this story here. 57 officers are now resigning from the force. And you might hear that and think, oh, this is great. But listen to why they're resigning. They are resigning because the 2 officers who pushed him got punished. The 2 officers who pushed him got fired from the force after that clip went viral. And so now 57, by the way, this is their entire emergency response force. Their entire force is just resigning in solidarity over the fact that those guys got fired. In other words, they are more concerned about the fact that police officers got punished for arguably one of the first times ever than they are about the fact that their own response team was shoving elderly people, and not listening before acting. I mean, this is completely outrageous. Let me just show you this here. So more than 50 officers in Buffalo have resigned in support of 2 colleagues who were suspended after showing them shoving a 75-year-old peace activist to the ground who cracked his head and was hospitalized with severe injuries. The 57 officers comprise the entire Buffalo Police Department emergency response team. Now, to be clear here, they will still be employed by the Buffalo Police Department, but they will no longer work on the emergency response team. So they are resigning in solidarity because they didn't like the fact that an officer was getting punished for doing bad things, for shoving people, not listening first and just acting first. And what's the defense? What's the defense going around? They're saying, look, man, they were just following orders. That's what the police union came out and said. Look, man, they were just following orders. So how are you going to punish them for it? Guys, you have an obligation to disobey unjust laws. And by the way, to be super, super clear here, in that instance where he's trying to walk up and give a helmet, if they had spent 3 seconds just listening, they could have A, followed their orders and not shoved the person. So this isn't an instance of a conflict between, oh, well, on one hand, I have the moral obligation to obey my orders, and on the other hand, I don't want to shove people. This is just an instance of if they had spent just a few seconds of treating him like a human, of listening to what he had to say, then none of this would have happened. But no, it was act first and then think later. It was just let me act rashly and just push someone over because it's curfew, not realizing how old he is and how he may not be able to handle a push like that. You have to treat people as human beings, as individuals. You can't treat people like cattle. You can't just herd people around. And it's outrageous to see videos like this. It's outrageous. And it goes to show you how this is a culture. That police violence, police brutality is a culture. Why would all 57 of those police officers resign if they also didn't have the mentality? Which, by the way, if you watch the clip again. Go back and watch that clip again. All these officers are just standing around, just watching, not even doing anything. And by the way, it gets even more outrageous than this. Before that video came out, Buffalo police officers said a protester with a headroom tripped and fell. Video shows that they lied. In other words, all of these police officers here that you see in this photo, every single one of them, and you can go back and watch this video, all of them saw it. And there are other angles, by the way, and you can see all the police officers turn their heads. So they all saw this thing, but every single one of them were going to let those guys get away. They were going to let them get away with a lie, saying, oh, well, he just tripped and fell. Yeah, guys, it's a culture. It's a culture. Now, actually, I want to be clear because I've talked about this a couple times. I'm starting to wonder whether or not it really is a culture. Why? It's because it's not a debate between bad apples and between it's a culture, but because, if you look at it and it's a culture here, in say Houston, in Los Angeles, in Seattle, and there's a few cities across the country where it's like, okay, there's a culture of bad cops. But when it's in every single police department across the country, it's in New York City, it's in Buffalo, it's in Los Angeles, it's in Seattle, it's in Houston, it's in Jackson, it's in your small local hometown, then is it really a culture, or is it an instance of the institution creating a culture? Right? Is it an instance where the institution of policing itself is creating a culture in which there is no accountability, in which there is no accountability for police officers who do bad things, and which there is a punishment to police officers who try to enforce accountability on others? Right? Because then there could be retribution. If they try to make another officer accountable, then there could be retribution. Because, oh, well, you just don't understand the stress of the job, man. It's just so hard. But this goes to another point, which I've been starting to think about as I've been watching all of these police brutality videos unfold, which is that in many respects, these officers see the application of justice upon them as being arbitrary in some sense, right? Because if the camera wasn't there, if the camera wasn't rolling on those Buffalo police officers, yeah, they would have gotten away with it. Yeah, they would have gotten away with it because, you just saw their initial report filed said that the guy tripped and fell, and all of these officers would have let them get away with it. And so now, what does that mean? It means that whether or not there's a camera on them says whether or not they get away with it. And so their application of justice to them is arbitrary. So the rules which apply to them when a punishment does or does not apply is just ad hoc. It's just ad hoc, and things are just applied ex post facto. And so there is no true rules that they can know, okay, if I do this, then X bad thing happens to me, because there isn't accountability. They don't have rules to govern them, right? That's one of the penalties of being above the law, which is that sometimes things go bad, sometimes things go good, and there is no way to actually know what's going to happen when you do something. Like, am I going to get punished? Am I not going to get punished? I don't know. Most of the time you don't, but then sometimes if it turns out there's a camera on you, then yeah, you get punished. Same thing with George Floyd. If there was not a camera on George Floyd, then honestly, yeah, Derek Chauvin would probably be out right now driving around, cruising around in his police cruiser, pulling people over, possibly killing other people, if there wasn't a camera on him. Which goes to say, if this had happened, if the whole George Floyd thing had happened just a few hours later and people weren't out on the streets, yeah, man, Derek Chauvin would have gotten away with it. All those officers standing by, watching, they'd still be on the force. They would still be on the force if there wasn't that accountability, if there weren't those cameras out there. So we've got to, for even the sanity of the police officers themselves, we've got to hold officers accountable so that then they can know, okay, if I do this, then there will be this punishment, right? Because if it's arbitrary, if it's just sometimes I get away with things, just sometimes I'm not, then yeah, I'm being honest, as much as I get outraged by this, you can sort of start to see how other officers would perceive that as arbitrary and perceive that as unfair. They say, oh, I'm just following orders the way that they did there. I was just following orders. How are you going to get me in trouble, man? How are you going to get me in trouble? I was just following orders, and usually when I push someone, especially when I'm just following orders, I don't get in trouble. But now suddenly I do. That's not fair. That's how the police officers feel, man. So what we've got to do is make sure that these police officers are held accountable every single time. That's how you make sure that the application of justice on these officers isn't arbitrary. You make sure that it's fair. You make sure that it's just not applied ad hoc on the basis of whether or not there's a camera around at the time. Right? It's got to be consistent. It's got to be, man. It's got to be consistent on these officers for the sake, again, of the officers themselves. That mental stress, that then added mental stress of maybe there's a camera around, maybe there's not, is damaging to even the officers. Even the officers are having a hard time in policing. Because, guys, I go back to it, man. I go back to it. 40% of police officers have some kind of domestic violence issue in their household. 40% of cops beat their wives. That's the headline, right? That's the statistics. That's the number. Don't get mad at me. Those are the numbers, right? That's not normal, guys. That's not normal. Policing is a hard job, but that's not justification for the actions of policing. That's not justification for the actions of police officers. That's justification to reform the job of policing. Because it's too hard, man. It's too hard on these officers. They can't handle it. They lash out and they push people, right? That's not a normal thing to do. Normally, you listen to someone. Someone's walking up to you and they got a helmet in their hand, a police helmet. You're like, oh, they've got a helmet. Let's hear what they have to say. A normal person doesn't, first thing they do, push someone. That's not normal, right? That's not a normal thing to do. I mean, there's so much stress. Policing is such a difficult job that we've got to rechange, we've got to reformulate the entire way the thing is done. We've got to make sure that there's equal and fair accountability so that every single time an officer does a bad thing, they get punished for it consistently. So they know, okay, if I do X, then Y punishment occurs to me, right? It's got to be consistent and it's got to be universal. So anyway, those are just some of my thoughts on some of this stuff. If you like this video, I'd really appreciate it if you hit the like button and consider subscribing. Thanks.